Picture this. It's 12:15 a.m. on March 10, 1945. Tokyo is sleeping. Over 7 million people are tucked away in their wooden homes, paper walls, and bamboo structures. The air raid sirens had wailed earlier that evening, but nobody paid attention anymore. After all, they'd heard those same sirens dozens of times over the past months, and nothing had happened. False alarms had become as routine as the morning newspaper. But high above the clouds, something was different tonight. Something Japan had never seen before. Something so revolutionary, so devastating, that in just 6 hours, it would kill more people than the atomic bomb that would fall on Hiroshima 5 months later. 334 American B-29 superfortresses were approaching the Japanese coast. But these weren't the same high-altitude precision bombers that had been hitting Japan for months. Tonight, General Curtis LeMay had stripped away every gun except the tail turrets. Tonight, they were flying at 5,000 feet instead of 30,000. And tonight, they carried something that would turn central Tokyo into hell on earth. The Japanese coast watchers heard them coming around midnight. But something was wrong. These planes sounded different. They were flying lower than anything they'd encountered before. By the time the first confused reports reached Tokyo's defense headquarters, it was already too late. What happened next would become known as Operation Meeting House, but the people of Tokyo would remember it as the night their city became a sea of fire. In 6 hours, 100,000 people would be dead. Over 1 million would be homeless. And an area of 15.8 square miles, nearly 20 miles of urban landscape, would be completely erased from the map. But here's what makes this story truly shocking. Japan never saw it coming. Not just the attack itself, but the revolutionary tactics that made it possible. The American forces had developed a completely new method of warfare, one that exploited every weakness in Japan's defense system. They turned the weather itself into a weapon. They used Japan's own building materials against them. And they did it all while flying low enough that people could see the pilots' faces in the cockpit windows. This is the story of the single most devastating night of World War II. The night that proved wooden cities and paper walls were no match for American innovation and incendiary bombs. The night that changed warfare forever and brought the Japanese Empire to its knees. You think you know about the bombing of Japan? You think Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the worst attacks? Think again. What happened in Tokyo on March 10, 1945 was so catastrophic that American bomber crews flying 5,000 feet above the city could smell burning flesh through their oxygen masks. So intense that the heat updrafts from the fires below literally lifted 30-ton bombers hundreds of feet into the air like toys. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how this night of horror became possible, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand how Japan built a defense system that looked impenetrable on paper but had fatal flaws that would cost them everything. Make sure you hit that subscribe button because this story will change everything you thought you knew about World War II. January 1945. Emperor Hirohito stood in his palace, looking out over Tokyo, the heart of an empire that stretched across the Pacific. On paper, Japan looked invincible. They had 64 radar installations protecting the home islands, hundreds of fighter aircraft, thousands of anti-aircraft guns. A civil defense system that had trained millions of citizens to fight fires and protect their neighborhoods. But appearances can be deadly deceiving. What the emperor didn't know, what almost no one in the Japanese military understood, was that their entire defense system was built on a foundation of fatal flaws. Flaws that a brilliant American general was about to exploit in the most devastating way possible. Let me paint you the picture of Japan's radar network, because this is where the story of their downfall really begins. Those 64 radar sites? They sound impressive until you realize that 11 of them had both Army and Navy radars sitting side by side, basically doing the same job twice. It's like having two security guards watching the exact same door while leaving the back entrance wide open. The technical specifications were even worse. Japanese radars could detect aircraft at about 130 kilometers for single planes, maybe 250 for large formations. But here's the kicker, and this detail will blow your mind. The Japanese had a protocol that when enemy aircraft got within 10 miles, they would shut down their radars to prevent the Americans from using them as homing beacons. Think about that for a second. The exact moment when radar becomes most crucial, when the enemy is almost on top of you, that's when the Japanese turn theirs off. It's like closing your eyes right before someone throws a punch. But the problems went deeper than just technology. The Japanese military was riddled with inter-service rivalry so intense that the Army and Navy literally refused to share radar research with each other. While American forces were developing integrated command systems, Japanese defenders couldn't even talk to each other effectively. And then there was the intelligence failure that makes everything else look like a minor oversight. The Japanese army entered World War II with exactly 20 officers and 20 enlisted men handling intelligence at the Army General Staff level. 20 people. To analyze intelligence for a war spanning the entire Pacific Ocean. Want to know how bad their intelligence estimates were? At Guadalcanal, they thought they were fighting 2,000 Marines when there were actually 10,000. At the Philippines, they estimated 25,000 American troops when there were 80,000. At Singapore, they thought the British had 30,000 men when they actually had 85,000. But here's what's truly incredible. Even with all these weaknesses, Japan might have survived if not for one man's revolutionary idea. A man whose tactics were so radical that his own superiors thought he'd lost his mind. A man who was about to prove that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't more firepower, it's thinking completely differently about how to use the firepower you already have. That man was General Curtis LeMay, and he had a plan that would shock the world. Curtis LeMay was not your typical American general. At 38 years old, he'd already earned the nickname Iron Ass from his bomber crews, partly for his tough demeanor, but mostly because he had a habit of sitting in the same position for hours during long missions, never moving, never flinching, no matter how heavy the anti-aircraft fire got. By March 1945, LeMay was in charge of XXI Bomber Command in the Pacific, and he was frustrated. For months, American B-29s had been flying precision bombing missions against Japan from 30,000 feet. The results? Pathetic. High altitude meant poor accuracy. Jet stream winds at that altitude were so fierce they could blow bombs miles off target. And Japan's war production was actually increasing despite the bombing. But LeMay had been studying something that would change everything: Japanese construction methods. While American and European cities were built with steel, concrete, and brick, Japanese cities were different. Tokyo wasn't just built with wood, it was built with the most flammable materials imaginable. Paper walls, bamboo frameworks, closely packed wooden structures with narrow alleyways between them. LeMay realized he'd been thinking about this all wrong. Instead of trying to hit specific military targets, what if he targeted the cities themselves? What if he turned Japan's own building materials into weapons? The idea was radical. It went against everything the Army Air Forces had been teaching about strategic bombing. But LeMay was convinced it would work. There was just one problem: it would require tactics so revolutionary that they bordered on insane. Here's what LeMay proposed: strip all the defensive guns off the B-29s except the tail turrets. This would increase their bomb-carrying capacity by 65%, but leave them almost defenseless. Fly at night instead of day when Japanese fighter response would be minimal. And most shocking of all, fly low. Really low. Between 5,000 and 9,000 feet instead of the usual 30,000 plus. His own air crews thought he'd lost his mind. Flying that low would put them well within range of Japanese anti-aircraft guns. The planes would be sitting ducks. But LeMay had done his homework. Japanese anti-aircraft crews were trained to fire at high-altitude targets. Their guns weren't properly calibrated for low-level attacks, especially at night. The bomber he chose to test this theory? Not B-17s or B-24s, but the new B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber in the world. Each plane could carry 10 tons of bombs when stripped of excess weight. And the bombs LeMay selected weren't conventional explosives. They were incendiaries. Specifically, M69 napalm bomblets packed into E-46 cluster bombs. When these bombs opened in the air, they would scatter hundreds of small napalm canisters across a wide area. Each canister would stick to whatever it hit and burn at temperatures over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. But LeMay's most brilliant innovation was the targeting strategy. Instead of scattered attacks across the city, he would concentrate everything on a single densely populated area, the Shitamachi district of Tokyo, where over 1 million people lived packed into just 12 square miles. The plan was set. The date was chosen. And Japan had absolutely no idea what was coming. March 9, 1945. 2:30 p.m. Guam. Airmen of the XXI Bomber Command gathered in their briefing rooms, expecting another routine mission briefing. What they heard instead left many of them stunned into silence. "Gentlemen," the briefing officer announced, "tonight you're going to burn down Tokyo." The room erupted. Questions flew from every corner. Did he say burn down? Are we targeting civilians now? What about the Geneva Convention? But as the details unfolded, the true scope of LeMay's revolutionary plan became clear. The target, a 3 by 4 mile area of Tokyo containing 750,000 people, one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. The method, low-level incendiary bombing using tactics never before attempted in warfare. The goal? create a firestorm so intense it would be visible from 150 miles away. But here's what makes this moment even more incredible. As American aircrews prepared for the most devastating bombing mission in history, life in Tokyo continued exactly as normal. Families gathered for dinner. Children played in the streets. Workers headed home from factories. Nobody knew that in just a few hours, their city would become an inferno. The Japanese military had indeed intercepted American radio messages as early as March 3, indicating major operations were being planned. But their intelligence analysts made a critical error. They assumed any large-scale bombing would follow the same high-altitude daylight pattern they'd been seeing for months. At 6 p.m. Tokyo time, air raid sirens began wailing across the city. But this was nothing new. For weeks, sirens had been sounding regularly as high-altitude B-29s passed over on reconnaissance flights or small-scale bombing runs. Most residents barely looked up from their dinner tables. What they didn't know was that 334 B-29 superfortresses were already in the air, flying a route that would bring them to Tokyo from the southeast. But these weren't the same B-29s that had been hitting Japan for months. These planes had been modified specifically for LeMay's radical experiment. Every unnecessary weight had been stripped away. Defensive guns had been removed from all positions except the tail. The bomb bays were packed with incendiaries, over 1,600 tons of napalm bomblets that would turn central Tokyo into a sea of fire. The lead aircraft carried something even more sinister. Pathfinder crews with a specific mission to create a giant fiery X pattern over the target area. This burning cross would guide the following waves of bombers, ensuring that their incendiaries would fall in a concentrated pattern designed to create the perfect conditions for a firestorm. As the sun set over Tokyo on March 9, the weather conditions were ideal for LeMay's plan. Winds were steady from the southeast at 17 to 28 miles per hour, perfect for spreading fire rapidly across the closely packed wooden buildings. Humidity was low, making everything more flammable. And the temperature was just right for creating the convection currents that would turn individual fires into one massive inferno. At 10:30 p.m., the first air raid sirens began sounding again. But this time, most people ignored them completely. 11:45 p.m., March 9, 1945. Tokyo Bay. The first Japanese coast watcher to spot the approaching American formation couldn't believe what he was seeing through his binoculars. The B-29s were flying so low he could make out individual aircraft details. Some were flying at just 4,900 feet, lower than any American bomber had ever approached Japan before. "This can't be right," he muttered to his radio operator. "Check the altitude readings again." But it was right. And it was about to get much worse. The coastwatchers' confusion was exactly what LeMay had counted on. Every aspect of this attack was designed to paralyze Japanese decision-making. The low altitude. The nighttime approach. The route from the southeast instead of the usual approaches from the east or north. Even the formation pattern was different. Instead of tight defensive formations, the B-29s were spread out in a long stream. By the time the coastwatchers' frantic radio reports reached Tokyo's Air Defense Headquarters, the first Pathfinder aircraft were already over the city. 12:08 a.m., March 10, 1945. Central Tokyo. Captain Robert Morgan, piloting the lead B-29, peered down at the darkened city below. From 7,000 feet, Tokyo stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast carpet of wooden buildings and narrow streets. In the pale moonlight, he could see the Imperial Palace, the Sumida River snaking through the city, and the dense Shitamachi district that was about to become his target. "Bomb bay doors open," he announced over the intercom. What happened next took exactly 3 minutes and changed the course of history. The Pathfinder aircraft released their loads of M47 napalm bombs in a precise pattern designed to create a massive fiery X over the target area. As these initial incendiaries hit the ground and exploded into flames, they created navigation markers that could be seen from 50 miles away. But the psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical one. As the first fires began to spread through the wooden buildings, people who had been sleeping peacefully just minutes before suddenly found themselves surrounded by flames. The narrow streets that had seemed like cozy neighborhoods became death traps as fires spread faster than people could run. Michiko Kiyo, a 22-year-old factory worker, was awakened by what sounded like rain on her roof. When she looked outside, she saw what looked like silver rain falling from the sky. It wasn't water. It was molten napalm still burning as it fell. "I watched my neighbor's house catch fire," she would later recall. The flames were blue and white, not orange like regular fire. And they moved so fast. One minute his house was there, the next minute it was gone. As the Pathfinder fires created their blazing X pattern across central Tokyo, 275 more B-29s were approaching behind them, each carrying 6 tons of incendiary bombs. The temperature on the ground was about to reach 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds were about to accelerate to hurricane force from the heat. And over 1 million people were about to discover that escape was impossible. The firestorm was beginning. 12:15 a.m., March 10, 1945. 8-year-old Haruo Nihei was sleeping peacefully when the sound of aircraft engines woke her family. Her father rushed to the window and saw something that made him freeze in terror. The sky was raining fire. "Everyone get out. Now," he screamed. But as the Nihei family stumbled into the street, they discovered something that would haunt Haruo for the rest of her life. There was nowhere to run. The Pathfinder aircraft had done their job perfectly. The giant fiery X they created was now guiding wave after wave of B-29s to their target. Every 30 seconds, another bomber was releasing its 6-ton load of incendiary bomblets across the densely packed neighborhoods. And those narrow streets that had seemed so charming during peacetime were becoming death traps. Picture this scene because you need to understand the full horror of what was happening. Each M69 napalm bomblet was designed to penetrate through roofs and floors before exploding. When it detonated, it would spread burning napalm gel across an area 50 feet in diameter. But in a city where buildings were packed so closely together you could reach from one window and touch the neighbor's wall, this meant that individual fires immediately spread to become block-wide infernos. And the wind was making everything worse. Those 17 to 28 miles per hour southeast winds that LeMay had counted on were now accelerating due to the heat, creating convection currents that turned individual fires into a single massive firestorm. Yoshiko Hashimoto, 24 years old and carrying her baby, was trying to navigate through streets clogged with desperate people when she witnessed something that defied belief. The fires were creating their own weather. Hot air was rising so rapidly that it was pulling in cold air from all directions, creating winds of 60 to 70 miles per hour that were strong enough to lift people off their feet and throw them into the flames. "The baby was crying and I couldn't see anything through the smoke," she would later recall. "People were pushing and screaming all around us. And then I felt this incredible heat on my back, like someone had opened the door of a giant oven." The temperature in central Tokyo had reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt copper. The Sumida River, which many people were trying to reach for safety, was starting to boil. And still more B-29s kept coming. But here's the detail that will give you chills. The American bomber crews flying at 5,000 to 9,000 feet could smell burning flesh through their oxygen masks. The smoke and heat were so intense that turbulence from the fires below was throwing 30-ton bombers around like toys. Several B-29s were lifted over 1,000 feet in seconds by the thermal updrafts. "I could see people running in the streets below," remembered B-29 tail gunner Richard Marshall. "Little figures running in every direction. And then the smoke got so thick I couldn't see anything anymore. But the smell? God, the smell went right through our oxygen system." The firestorm was now completely out of control and it was about to get much worse. 12:45 a.m., March 10, 1945. What was happening in Tokyo had never been seen before in human history. The individual fires from thousands of incendiary bombs were coalescing into something meteorologists would later classify as a firestorm, essentially a tornado made of fire. Katsumoto Satomu was 12 years old when he watched his entire neighborhood transform into what he could only describe as hell on earth. Standing on his family's roof, he could see fires stretching as far as the horizon in every direction. But what terrified him most wasn't what he saw, it was what he heard. "It sounded like a freight train," he recalled decades later. "But louder. Much louder. It was the sound of air being sucked into the fire. Like the city itself was breathing." What Katsumoto was hearing was the firestorm creating its own atmosphere. The intense heat was causing air to rise so rapidly that it was creating a low-pressure zone at ground level. This was pulling in cold air from all directions at hurricane force speeds, feeding oxygen to the fires and making them burn even hotter. The physics of what was happening were terrifying. As more oxygen fed the flames, temperatures rose even higher. As temperatures rose, more air was pulled in. It was a feedback loop that turned central Tokyo into a blast furnace. And people were trapped inside it. Families who had lived on the same street for generations found themselves separated by walls of fire that moved faster than human beings could run. Yoshiko Hashimoto, still carrying her baby, made it 3 blocks from her home before discovering that the street ahead was completely blocked by flames. Behind her, the fires had already consumed everything. To her left and right, more fires were racing toward her. She wasn't alone. Thousands of people were finding themselves in the same impossible situation, surrounded by fire with no escape route. The narrow streets that had given these neighborhoods their intimate community feel were now channeling fire like the flues of a massive furnace. But some people were making desperate choices that would haunt survivors forever. At the Kototoi Bridge over the Sumida River, hundreds of people had gathered, hoping the water would provide safety. What they found instead was a scene from Dante's Inferno.